Man, what an unbelievable season it has been. I look back at this year, and there's some trends, there's some things that were new. Winning Angler of the Year last year gave me a lot of confidence, and to do it 2 years back to back, I mean, I couldn't even. I was thinking about this the other day. I couldn't even imagine like my 16-year-old self seeing what the future had to offer. It's really been an unbelievable adventure and ride all the way to this point, and I figured I would just take you guys through some of the season and sort of some of the behind the scenes stuff maybe you don't know about, or just some of the thoughts that I had on how this season has gone. And tournament by tournament, each tournament is completely unique, and I think that a lot of times as anglers we get our confidence baits, and we get hey, we caught them here doing this, so we try to take that tournament to tournament. So sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, but you really have to adapt. And I think over the years recently, I think if you're gonna win Angler of the Year, you can't really be a specialist. And what I mean by that is you look back in the past of a Denny Brower, where he's well known for flipping a jig, or a guy who's locked into one particular technique, or Dean Rojas throwing a frog. You have to be super versatile. With learning curve being so much quicker these days with YouTube and all the content out here, you have to be able to utilize every technique and have to be pretty good at all of them out there. And if there is a new technique out there, then you better learn it fairly quickly. So I figured I would jump into the first event, starting off at Lake D'Arbonne. We had some adversity to deal with in the beginning of the season. Starting off the first tournament of the year, we actually had 1 day of practice. I did not get a chance to go down there and pre-practice at all. So you have 1 day to go look around at this body of water, and then you start your season off. And it was sort of a cool deal because we had 3 lakes that we were actually fishing. One, Lake D'Arbonne, was where we started the main competition days. That's 4 days of competition there. Then the knockout round, if you qualified or made the top 40, you qualified on to move to Caney Lake, and then the championship was on Bussy Break. Well, on D'Arbonne, I remember in practice, it's snowing, and it's frigid cold, just sleet and winds blowing, 20-mile-an-hour winds. And I think I had 2 total bites in practice. So I was like a little bit worried, but I knew, hey, look, I could probably pick up Tiny. I got some bites on Tiny. And those are the tournaments that can scare you a little bit, but those are the ones you really have to trust your gut. I caught some fish in that tournament on Tiny. Then I also picked up a jig. When things get tough, sometimes just picking up a little half-ounce jig, pitching it around. I really had to finesse in order to get those bites. I did catch, I think, 1 or 2 on a finesse Nico on a drop shot. I think caught the biggest fish at the tournament of that day, or at least of that first couple of days on a drop shot. And so it wasn't, you had to sort of junk fish, if you will, to generate a few bites. And going on to Caney was completely different. I had some giant fish, some 8-pounders throwing a big jerk bait, and catching these fish over these points, and then caught like a 32-pound bag of fish. But I ended up in best 5, and I think I had like 8 for 40 or something like that. I won the knockout round, qualifying for the championship. And then Bussy was completely different. It was just a bush flipping deal, and I caught a few fish and ended up making a good top 10 there. So super good to start the season off at a lake that you didn't really know how it was all going to fish. You went from a dirty water to clear water to a bush's lake, and it just was cold. It had a big cold front coming in to the beginning of the tournament. So jumping into Lake Fork, I put some time into Lake Fork. Water was low. Lake Fork is still like, it's an amazing fishery. It's one of those places that you go to and you're just like, wow, there's just all this timber, and it's just world renowned. You hear Lake Fork, you think of big giant bass, and it seemed to be that way, and having a good event, starting off the event pretty strong. I think the first cast of the tournament, I caught, it might have been first or second cast, I caught a 7.5-pounder on a Shadow Rap Deep. And so that sort of set the tone for the event. Caught several really nice fish. Really was a jerk bait. That was very much so like a active target, live scope forward fishing sonar event. out in junior ended up winning the event, but I was able to sort of figure it out. And you had to still adapt every single day. If you would go through an area, it didn't seem like you were gonna go catch those fish again. You would burn those fish and they would move on. So it ended up being really cold as well for that event. Being in February, actually during the knockout round, I qualified at the championship automatic berth because I won the qualifying rounds. It was actually like sleeting. You know, we had to postpone championship day because there was like a half of an inch of ice on the ramp. I mean, this is the adversity you're gonna deal with. And so championship day, it was probably 37 or 38 for the high. I remember being frigid cold. It's very hard to move, but caught some really nice fish, you know, lost a few, but overall having another top 10 was a really big part of like that, you know, hey, we're starting the year off right, you know, and now this is the thing, you know, you go from those two events where, you know, sort of now we jump forward into stage 3. In Smith Lake, you know, spotted bass fishery. So you went from, hey, you know, lowland reservoir, dirty water to, you know, Lake Fork to spotted bass fishery. And again, you know, didn't have a good practice at all. Just sort of the thing that I try to teach and I try to tell people a lot is when you're out competing, you know, I think in a local tournament, in a weekday tournament or weeknight or weekend tournament, you sort of have your spots in your lake that you like to fish. And as a professional angler traveling all over the country, you really try to, I personally have learned I can get myself in a really bad position if I try to lock in to a certain pattern or a spot. You know, I like to give myself multiple options, okay? And so at Smith Lake, I sort of had some good bites cranking. I caught some fish. Water was running in. There were some run-ins. Caught some fish on run-ins, but that was drying. That was going to dry up for the tournament, I felt like. And then I caught some fish out, suspended fish out in the middle of the lake. And I just was like, okay, whatever. Started the tournament off throwing a DT8 and caught a few fish doing that. But then, you know, I sort of got on a little deal in the event. I think I caught 3 or 4 bass out off in the abyss, as I would say it, that were suspended out in no man's land on bait in practice, and it sort of clued me in a little bit. And I started doing that in the tournament, pitching a big jigging wrap, and you know, winning the round doing that, throwing a jigging wrap out in 70, 80, 90 foot of water on single spotted bass, on groups of spotted bass. It was like, it was the first time that I've actually just absolutely wrecked them on a jigging wrap. I've caught a lot of fish on a jigging wrap throughout the years, and some anglers have really got on that deal over the last couple years with being able to see what was going on, but these fish were completely nomadic. And so I had to learn as I went. Like I had no clue. Like if you would have asked me in the beginning of that tournament, how are you going to catch them? I would have said I was going to catch them on a DT8. I really felt that was sort of the pattern that was moving to be the right one. I was catching a little bit better than average fish, and I just sort of, I had multiple rods rigged up, and I roll out there, and I ended up also catching a lot of them on a little 3-inch Largo shad, you know, on a jig head. So if the fish were suspended up high, I would throw the Largo shad on a 3/16 jig head, and then I would, you know, if they were down deeper, I would utilize a jigging wrap because those fish, I could get to them. They were moving. They weren't on a piece of cover. They weren't on a brush pile. They weren't on a rock. They were constantly moving, and so that's what really made it difficult to follow those fish around. Now, it ended up being doing something similar to that, but it was something that I ended up having another good finish. My good buddy, you know, Atafo, fellow Rapala Pro staff member, ended up had a good event that event. I think I ended up finishing another top 10. So 3 top 10s to start off the season. I had no complaining to do, and going into the following event at Lake the Ozarks, completely change gears, okay? Now you go from pre-spawn, hey, I was catching them jerking, I was catching them doing all this stuff, to, hey, now it's, you know, late April in the Ozarks, you got a little bit of warm weather coming, and I'll tell you what was sort of interesting to this event. I felt like, hey, I did not go and pre-practice in this event. I pre-practiced a couple events, but I did not pre-practice like the Ozarks because I felt like, you know, hey, you need to go fish shallow, and you don't know what pockets and areas are going to be good on the lake until you get there. The lake could come up 10 feet and it might be completely different. So I didn't go in pre-practice. I went and put my time in. And then in practice, I had 2 days. I ran around, and I found a lot of areas that these fish were really starting to pull up. They're sort of suspended underneath docks, some were spawning. And I was able, that was one event that I sort of knew what I was going to do, if you will. Like, you had to sort of know, like, you better know the areas. And I still was continuing to look and continue to, but that was really more of a visual deal. I was targeting spawning fish and fish that were just pulling up, and that was more of a sight fishing event. But this is a really good example. And that's what I was talking about earlier on is a friend of mine loves to fish for pre-spawn fish. And going into that event, he's like, I'm gonna fish for the pre-spawners. I just don't even care. That's what I'm gonna do. And he ended up having a really bad tournament, tough event. You can't be hard-headed in this sport. You know, 3 tournaments passed. We've had 3 pre-spawn tournaments. We caught them that, you know, caught a lot of fish that way. Pre-spawn, setting up on points, stuff like that. That is a lot of fun. I enjoy the pre-spawn. But when that time comes, you have to adjust and make the decision and make the push to the bank. And you know, that's part of it. Adjusting in tournament bass fishing is what it's all about. That was something I had to learn, but I ended up making another top 10, qualifying, auto bid into the championship round, and the water came up. I did not make a really good adjustment that final day. Water came up, water got dirty, I couldn't visually see. I was casting a little swim bait around, pitching around, and it just didn't end up working out for a win, but it was a good event. You know, I ended in our top 10, so now I'm sitting here with a 25, I think, mid-20s point lead going into Watch Bar. Now, Watch Bar was definitely a big question mark on the tour because there really hadn't been a major national event ever on Watch Bar Lake, which Watch Bar is a part of the Tennessee River, to give you guys an understanding. And when you hear the Tennessee River in June, you think of, hey, I'm going to reel them in on a DT16. And so I remember the first day of practice for Watch Bar. It's a big lake. I live only an hour from there, but I don't know it very well. And I'm looking for schools of fish offshore because that's just what I know. Tennessee River bass fishing, use my electronics, cranking, and I found a few groups of fish that were mixed in with the white bass. And that was an interesting deal because it's Chickamauga and a lot of these other lakes that I fish, they don't really have as many white bass and stripers. So I found some groups of fish mixed in with the white bass, and you'd catch striper, largemouth, striper, smallmouth. And so you catch them mixed in, and I felt like, oh, maybe that's the deal. You know, all these fish are out offshore. But I already had these preconceived notions that I had to fish this certain way. Like I didn't have a good practice. Now I had a lot of brush. I did pre-practice up there and graphed around and found a lot of like isolated cover, brush, rock, places, because that was sort of my backup. Like if everything does not go as planned and I don't find any big groups of fish, I could always run isolated places if fishing's tough and eventually find an area that it would go down. So first day of practice, I run 200 miles or 220. I had to get gas in the water both days of practice to tell you that's how much I was running around, looking around, trying to figure this place out. And then I ended up catching some good fish on a DT10 day 1 of the tournament, but it ended up not being the deal. It ended up being where I started to run a little bit of brush, and I'm like, hey, this is a little bit better. And I started looking for more brush in the tournament. Found some grass, I fished a little bit of grass, and it really came down to throwing a drop shot, just, drop shot worm, a 1/0 finesse Nico hook. That hook was phenomenal. I mean, you really casting it out there in those places and those fish bite it, send the hook, you had to something to have a little bit of meat on it where you'd get that fish out of there. And it was a drop shot. It was a drop shot, 101, caught some really nice fish, and I had to adjust in the event. Again, I had a game plan, but then you can't be so hard-headed that you're not going to make that adjustment when you need be. So I completely scrapped that after day 1. Sort of day 1, when you sort of see a lot of times the results, I'm really just sampling, okay? So I'm sampling what's going on. I'm sort of getting a vibe of what the fish are, because practice you're getting a sample, of course, but you're not really locking in. You don't know, you get 2 bites on a point, you don't know if there's 100 there, you don't know if there's 10 there, you don't know if there's 1 there or 2 there, So that's really what your first day of the tournament to me is really just once I can get that, oh, this is going on. And that's sort of what happened at Watch Bar. I really felt, before that tournament I would have said, man, I would just be happy to get a check. But ended up second place in that tournament, just barely missing the win by just a few ounces. And so that sort of like was a learning experience. I was a little bit worried about that event, but then ended up coming, with a good finish. And going into the next event was Cayuga. And Cayuga, I really didn't have much experience, tournament history on there. I did go pre-practice this event, graphed around a little bit. I remember in in May or mid-May, I was like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna have time to go up there and go look around. And I just said, hey, you know, one thing about tournament bass fishing is we spend a lot of time away from our families. I have two little ones. I have a little boy, baby Hudson, and a little girl, Olivia, and you know, my wife, of course. And so that's part of the deal where I decided, like, hey, look, I have a day off. I'd love to spend that time with them, but I actually had a few days off, and I drove 16 hours to go to Cayuga. I graphed around for a day because that's the time I had allowed for what I was, you know, and then I drove straight back home to spend time with them. And that really ended up helping me out quite a bit in the event. I mean, those couple, you know, even those one day of graphing around, just sort of getting an idea of what this lake looked like, really allowed for me to my mind, be mentally prepared going into that event. Now, I don't think we were all prepared to how good that fishing was going to be. It's arguably, I mean, my opinion, probably the best bass fishing lake in the north, in the northern part of the country. It seemed like it was just unbelievable with a 20-pound, you know, the 3 to 5 pound largemouth in that place, and then the 3 to 6 pound, 7 pound smallmouth in that place was insane as well, come to find out. So, but the thing that taught me a lot in that event, there was events that was forward-facing sonar heavy. That event was in no way really that, for me, was a grass deal. You had to fish, you're fishing grass. And you're not, when you get out there in grass beds, you have to fish to find those fish. You can't just, oh, well, pan this grass bed and graph this grass bed and be like, oh yeah, man, they're just loaded in this, and that's not the way it is. So what I was doing in practice, I really committed to it. I would throw a DT10 and a DT16. This is actually a DT10 I was throwing in practice as well, has some teeth marks on him, and a DT16 in bluegill. And absolutely, it was one of the best crankbait bites I've ever been on. It was insane. I also caught some fish on a drop shot throughout the tournament, but what was so cool about it was when I would throw that crankbait out there, the single, like if I would crank, like I was cranking irregularities, and I would fish like little points and turns and little places, and you'd hook one, and the only place that it really played with forward-facing sonar is I was able to pan out there and look and see how many were following it, and that really allowed for me to know, oh, hey, there's 6 or 8 bass sitting on this little point, or, you know, hey, that was a single that just ate the crankbait off a little turn. So it really came down to irregularities in the grass, which it tends to, no matter where you're at in the country, whether you're fishing shallow grass, deep grass, it's all about fishing irregularities. And so I was cranking points, I was cranking turns, and I found multiple schools of fish. And that crankbait, every morning I would just, it was like, you just reel them in. It was awesome. If you look at my Instagram, you could see a picture of those crankbaits, and it was just like absolutely chewed. I think I caught I think I caught 100 some bass, over 3 pounds on that DT16. I had retired it. It's not in my boat right now. It's retired because it's done its job. And so after that event, I learned, you know, a little bit more. I think you learn as a fisherman every single event. And going into the final event of the season, I had a pretty sizable lead. Going to Mille Lacs, which is big water. You know, I like smallmouth fishing, but you know, what's interesting about this is, you think smallmouth, one lake, you think a smallmouth is a smallmouth anywhere you go. A smallmouth up north is a smallmouth up north. It's not that way. There's smallmouth that are rock related. There's smallmouth that are bait related. There's smallmouth that sit up higher in the water column. And so one thing that was interesting about Mille Lacs was those smallmouth, you could not, in a lot of lakes you can go and you're fishing around and you're seeing, hey, a smallmouth sits out there, you know, 10 or 50 foot from the boat, and you see him out there. And you cast over there. Well, there's so many walleye in Mille Lacs, you couldn't, they were like, all the walleye were up off the bottom, and you could barely ever see the smallmouth. You would catch some, and a lot of them were boulder related, or you would use the forward facing sonar to see irregularities and see like, hey, there's a little bit bigger patch of rocks, or there's a bigger boulder, but very seldom would you actually see the fish. So that was something that took a little while to learn, where other lakes, clear bodies of water more specifically, they get up off the bottom a little bit more, and you could actually visually see the individual fish. And so that was something that took me a little while to learn. I would cast it a lot of times, just, oh, there's something over there, whoosh, cast over there, okay, and, oh, just starts taking off. So that was something that was unique, and something that I knew a little bit about, but it wasn't something that I was completely dialed into. And, you know, going through that event, you know, I ended up actually catching fish off of 2D. Fish that I could not, these smallmouths were so tight to the bottom that the first day of the tournament, I was dropping straight down. I'd finally see them because they were tucked down, so you wouldn't even see them out there. You'd be on a place, you'd be like, man, there's nothing out here. And then all of a sudden you'd be like, you see one out there on the bottom, doop, just drop down like old school, woo, catching them. So that was really like, I think there was sometimes, I think you know, new technology comes along and we sometimes think, hey, this is the only way to do it. This is the new best thing. But sometimes don't forget the old stuff because there's times that those things still play. And that was something that I had to learn. Now, my buddy Dustin ended up winning the tournament. And then we ended up in the only tournament, I didn't make a top 10 and I ended up 11th. My buddy Mike kicked me out the last second, like 7 minutes to go. I got kicked out of the top 10. But at the end of the day, we accomplished our goal. You know, the goal was to win Angler of the Year. The goal was to try to be the best angler every single year. And I think the key is like, you know, that's just a huge deal to me. Personally, my number one goal setting off is like, well, if you can be the best angler for that given year out of all the events that we go to, from spawn events to spotted bass to largemouth to dirty water to clear water, that's like a really big honor. It's a huge honor. So to do it last year, it was awesome. But to do it again this season, man, and have my little girl there, it was beyond special. It was beyond special. I know I did not win an event this season. You know, that was something that people were, hey, you know, I had an event last season where I won, or last year I won 3 events plus a cup event too. So I won 4 events, and this season I didn't win one. But it was consistency that really was all about making good decisions, trusting your gut, and just rolling with it. So 2022 was an unbelievable year. I showed you guys some of the baits that really played for me, and some of the decisions maybe give you a little bit of an insight of what it takes to be a professional bass angler. If you want to do it, it's definitely, listen, I'm a kid from Indiana that grew up 5 miles from downtown Indianapolis. If you want to try to be a professional bass angler, if I can do it, being in Indiana, I really can say with some sense of certainty that about anybody can make that happen. So thank you guys so much for watching this. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, but just wanted to give you guys a little rundown on how the year went and how it ended.